Tonight, history did not merely turn a page, it slammed the book shut on the era of predictable diplomacy with the force of a tectonic shift. The world is witnessing a strategic paralysis that the mainstream media, caught in its cycle of shallow sound bites and recycled narratives, is too blind to capture or even comprehend. The Islamabad negotiations have collapsed. They did not just stall. They disintegrated into a vacuum of mutual contempt and irreconcilable realities. The American vice president has returned to Washington, the engines of her C-32 screaming a confession of defeat across the Atlantic without a single sheet of paper representing even a shred of mutual understanding. This was not a failure of communication or a simple diplomatic misunderstanding. It was a calculated, cold-blooded, existential reckoning between two civilizations that no longer speak the same language of power. The receipts of this collapse are scattered like shrapnel across the corridors of power, from Islamabad to Tehran, from the sit room in the West Wing to the hardened bunkers beneath the Zagros Mountains. We are no longer looking at a diplomatic hurdle or a temporary setback in the peace process. What we are witnessing is the total demolition of the previous power architecture, a structure that has held the global order together since the end of the Cold War, now reduced to dust and broken promises. The bad news is unambiguous. Stripped of any comforting ambiguity or diplomatic nuance, no agreement was reached, and the operational window for a peaceful resolution has not just closed, it has been welded shut. The Strait of Hormuz has officially transitioned from a mere maritime passage into the world's most potent non-kinetic nuclear weapons. This is the broody truth that the official narratives are trying to mask with vague, optimistic fillers and talk of ongoing dialogues. But the data does not lie. The mathematics of the situation are as cold as they are terrifying. Let us walk through the options matrix, honestly, without the filters of partisan bias or the delusions of the donor class. There is a number currently haunting the quiet, dimly lit rooms of the Pentagon and the Treasury Departments of the West. 100 days. Say that number out loud and consider its weight. On the global scales of survival, it is not just a number. It is a countdown to a systemic collapse that no central bank can print its way out of. A leading global economic research center, staffed by analysts who spent decades modeling the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 2008 financial crisis, recently completed a high-fidelity simulation of a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz for exactly 100 days. The results were not just concerning, they were a roadmap to a global dark age. The simulation indicated that energy prices would not just rise, they would undergo a qualitative explosion, shattering all previous historical records within the first 48 hours. Brent crude would not just climb, it would enter a vertical ascent, vaporizing the logic of global trade. Supply chains that sustain the very lifeblood of modern civilization would suffer a total saturation of failure. The complex, fragile networks that deliver food to your table and electricity to your home. The just-in-time delivery model would become a never-again relic of a more stable past. Factories across the European continent, already reeling from the loss of cheap Russian gas, and the vast industrial hubs of Asia, the engines of global growth, would simply cease to breathe. They would become silent monuments to a globalized world that forgot the importance of hard power and secure geography. Inflation would not just be a metric discussed on cable news. It would become a predatory force, a silent thief that enters every home, vaporizing the remaining wealth of the middle class in an American economy that is already struggling to maintain its footing. Under the weight of historic debt, Washington is fully aware that these 100 days possess the power to force a price upon the American people that will not be forgotten for centuries. It would fundamentally rewrite the genetic code of the global economy forever, shifting the center of gravity away from the Atlantic and toward the resource-rich, militarily resurgent East. This realization, this bone-deep fear of a systemic heart attack, provides the only logical explanation for the massive military saturation we are seeing in the region today. The carriers and the destroyers filling the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea are not there for a mere show of force or a routine patrol. Their presence is a desperate attempt at maximum pressure, a toolkit designed to force Iran to blink before the first shot is even fired. Washington wants the Strait open at any cost, and it wants the Iranian nuclear program dismantled and carted away. But the events in Islamabad have flipped the table on everyone, leaving the American administration with a hand of cards that they no longer know how to play. The fall of the Islamabad talks was a mathematical certainty of clashing wills, not a failure of interest or a lack of effort. The American administration's post-withdrawal statements offered nothing but a confirmation of the strategic paralysis we have predicted for months. The problem was never the specific clauses of a document. The problem is who dictates the rules of engagement on the ground. Nothing has fundamentally changed after these talks except for the removal of the diplomatic makeup that was hiding the scars of a decades-long conflict. The truce was revealed to be nothing more than a tactical timeout for repositioning, a chance for both sides to sharpen their blades and check their magazines rather than a genuine path to peace. Negotiation was used as a test of endurance and a search for the breaking point of the adversary. The explosion has been delayed, yes, but the fuse remains lit, and it is burning faster than the analysts in Washington care to admit. When diplomacy hits a dead end, it signifies that the kinetic field has not yet whispered its final word. Islamabad was not a summit. It was a laboratory for measuring the qualitative military edge and the psychological resilience of both sides. We were witnessing a raw test of power, dressed in the expensive, tailored suits of international diplomacy. For 21 hours, the teams engaged in discussions that were described as productive and substantive by those who profit from the industry of hope. But the reality was a stark, grueling 21 hours of identifying the unbridgeable gaps between two incompatible visions of the future. The American vice president left the region with a clear message. Though she didn't have to say it out loud, this is a bad development for Iran, and it is a catastrophically bad development for the West. The conflict has evolved beyond a simple disagreement over nuclear centrifuges or enrichment levels at Fordow. It is now a total war over the redefinition of the balance of power across the entire region. From the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush, Washington seeks to vaporize the Iranian power structure, targeting its nuclear aspirations, its sophisticated missile toolkit, and its iron grip on the Strait of Hormuz. Conversely, Tehran is moving to solidify its influence, asserting its sovereignty over the world's most critical energy pathways, and establishing a permanent deterrent that makes any Western intervention an act of national suicide. These are two projects that cannot occupy the same physical or political space. One must break for the other to survive. The most dangerous byproduct of the Islamabad failure is the weaponization of geography. Iran now treats the Strait of Hormuz as its functional equivalent of a nuclear deterrent, a non-kinetic weapon of mass destruction that can be triggered with the push of a button or the deployment of a single sea mine. This is no longer just a transit point for crude oil. It has become the kill switch for the global economic machine. America demands that the strait remain open without conditions to ensure the continued flow of global energy lifeblood, a requirement for the survival of the current U.S.-led financial system. Iran, however, views the passage as its crown jewel of leverage, in a primary tool of strategic defense against a superpower that it believes is in terminal decline. This is not a gap that can be bridged by a clever paragraph in a treaty or a creative interpretation of international law. It is a strategic impossibility. Whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz does not merely control the price of a barrel of oil or the cost of shipping. They control the stability of global financial markets and the political survival of Western governments. The battle has shifted from a regional military skirmish to a global struggle for the right to decide the future. Iranian media outlets, including agencies like Tasnim and FLEES, which often serve as the unfiltered voice of the Revolutionary Guard, have been unambiguous in their signaling. They report that there will be no change in the status of the strait as long as Washington refuses to accept a reasonable framework, a framework that includes the total lifting of sanctions and the recognition of Iran as a regional hegemon. Iran is not in a hurry. They have learned to live in the shadows of the global economy, building a self-reliant resistance economy that is increasingly immune to Western pressure by rejecting Iranian terms. America has effectively handed the keys of the global economy to Tehran, hoping that a massive military buildup will be enough to scare them into returning the keys. But the massive American buildup intended to force a surrender has inadvertently turned the strait into both a shield and a sword for the opposition. We must look deeper into why Washington even agreed to the Islamabad talks in the first place. Was it a genuine search for peace, or was it a sophisticated war of maneuvers designed to buy time for a military that is stretched thin across multiple theaters? Deep analysis of the troop movements and the logistics trail suggests that Washington was attempting to clear a minefield of its own making. The American military needed this lull to deploy its most advanced minesweepers, its undersea drones, and its specialized destroyers under the guise of securing peaceful passages. They are acutely aware that thousands of randomly placed mines in the strait, some sophisticated, some primitive, all deadly, represent the ultimate asymmetrical threat. The goal was to conduct a comprehensive survey of Iranian positions and dismantle the obstacles to American naval dominance before the shooting started. This objective failed the moment Iran threatened to target and destroy any American vessel attempting to enter the restricted zones, regardless of its mission. The tactical window for a clean sweep has slammed shut, leaving the U.S. Navy to face a saturation environment where their multi-billion-dollar ships are vulnerable to $20,000 drones and $100,000 missiles. While the talks were ongoing, Washington attempted to reposition its assets in Qatar, Bahrain, and the Emirates. They wanted to move their forces out of the direct line of fire of Iranian missile saturation, recognizing that their traditional bases are now nothing more than stationary targets for the FATH 360 missile systems. They are facing a critical shortage of interceptor missiles, the TAAD and Patriot systems that are the only things standing between their troops and a rain of fire. Every day of delay in Islamabad was a day to replenish their defensive toolkit, to fly in more batteries and more technicians. The administration also sought to frame the narrative, presenting an offer that they knew would be rejected, and then withdrawing the delegation immediately to create a sense of crisis. The intent was to paint Tehran as the stubborn, irrational actor. In the eyes of the global community, including its partners in Moscow and Beijing, this was a desperate attempt to build the political legitimacy for the kinetic steps that are now inevitable. Tehran, however, identified the trap before the first meeting began. They kept the strait effectively closed through the threat of their mine architecture and refused to retreat a single inch on their core demands. Instead, they utilized the round of talks as a warrior's rest, a period to synchronize their moves with their Eastern allies. Reports indicate that during this diplomatic interlude, qualitative military supplies reached Iran from China and Russia. These include advanced man-portable air defense systems, electronic warfare suites that can blind American sensors, and other classified technologies that have not yet been revealed to the public. Iran arrived in Islamabad with a massive delegation to signal readiness, but their military sectors were already authorized to act if the table was broken. They weren't there to beg for relief. They were there to deliver an ultimatum. In the final hours before the American withdrawal, a new Iranian contingent arrived in Islamabad, led by high-ranking generals of the Revolutionary Guard rather than career diplomats. This raises a critical question. Was the American departure a response to a perceived bait or a specific intelligence warning? The speed at which the American delegation fled, leaving behind secure equipment and personal effects, raises significant red flags. The fear was likely not about security within Pakistan itself, but about the tracking and targeting of high-level assets by unconventional means. If a major leadership figure were to be targeted during their transit, the region would reach a point of no return. We are talking about the potential for an event that would vaporize any remaining hope for a contained conflict, turning a regional standoff into a global conflagration. What follows this failure is far more dangerous than the failure itself. We are seeing new lines of force entering the theater, including indirect Chinese technical support that suggests a preparation for a long-term struggle. The American naval movements are becoming increasingly erratic as they attempt to break the Iranian hegemony over the deck waterways without triggering a full-scale war they are not prepared to win. Simultaneously, the situation in Lebanon is being intentionally escalated, as if there is a deliberate effort to collapse any chance of a ceasefire and force a multi-front war that would overwhelm the Israeli and American defensive systems. This is no longer a binary conflict between two nations. It is the internationalization of a struggle for the next world order. The war is no longer about a single strike and a response. It is a war of attrition, economic strangulation, and the systematic dismantling of the opponent's will to resist. The winner in this new era will not be the one who delivers a knockout military blow. That is the fantasy of 20th century generals. The winner will be the one who successfully prevents their opponent from achieving their strategic goals while exhausting their resources and their domestic political capital. As the tension escalates, the discussion of strategic and non-conventional weapons is moving from the fringes to the center of the secret rooms. We are standing at the threshold of the most violent phase of this era, a phase that will be written in fire rather than ink, while the great powers maneuver. Other fronts are igniting through legal and diplomatic channels, creating a warfare environment that is just as deadly as the kinetic one. Turkey and Israel have entered a direct and unprecedented collision that signals a total breakdown of the old regional alliances that once anchored the Middle East. The Chief Prosecutor's Office in Istanbul has announced an indictment against 35 high-ranking Israeli officials, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. This list includes the Prime Minister, the National Security Minister, and the Defense Minister. The charges involve armed intervention and assaults on activists in international waters with requested prison sentences totaling thousands of years. This is not just a legal maneuver, it is a declaration of diplomatic war. The Turkish Minister of Justice has stated that the leadership in Tel Aviv will be held accountable for what he described as a network of massacres. While this move may be viewed as symbolic by some in the West, it is a critical component of the global isolation campaign. It represents a qualitative shift in how regional powers are using lawfare to challenge the qualitative military edge of their rivals. It is an attempt to turn the rules-based order against its own creators. The Israeli response has been characterized by a high degree of tension and visible agitation, a sign that the pressure is reaching the highest levels of the government. The defense minister issued threats to the Turkish leadership in their own language, reflecting a breakdown of diplomatic decorum and a return to a more primal form of communication. The national security minister resorted to public insults, signaling a leadership that is feeling the walls close in from all sides, legal, military, and economic. Israel views these legal maneuvers as a smokescreen for Turkey's own strategic failures and its domestic political troubles. However, the level of vitriol in the diplomatic exchange reveals a leadership under immense pressure. The promises of absolute victory have not materialized, leaving behind only isolation, a deepening internal crisis, and a military that is being forced to fight a war of attrition it was never designed for. Before we conclude this assessment, we must look at a pillar of the Western alliance that is currently trembling, hidden beneath the headlines of the Middle East. For weeks, the leadership in Washington and Tel Aviv has been obsessively focused on the elections in Hungary. One might ask why a Central European nation of 10 million people carries such weight in this global storm. The answer lies in the person of Viktor Orban, the most prominent symbol of the right-wing architecture in Europe. He is the closest ally of the previous American administration and the current Israeli leadership on the continent. He represents a critical node in the global network of the new right, a network that seeks to dismantle the liberal internationalist order from within. His survival is paramount to their long-term strategy of creating a fortress Europe that is aligned with their interests. Recent polling, conducted under the shadow of intense foreign pressure, suggests a high probability of a defeat for the Orban administration, creating a state of emergency among his international allies. This is why the Israeli Prime Minister went as far as to send his son to Budapest to deliver speeches in support of the ruling party. This is a level of direct intervention that signals deep desperation within the alliance. The American right has also funneled support, promising massive economic cooperation and political backing if the current leadership is maintained. If this pillar falls today, it will be a massive psychological and strategic blow to the global axis that is trying to hold its ground against the shifting tides of history. It would represent the loss of a crown jewel in the European theater, further isolating the forces that are pushing for a kinetic solution in the Middle East. The conclusion that no one in the mainstream media wants to tell you plainly is this: the failure in Islamabad is the starting gun for a massive explosion. Israel and its allies are attempting to force a new reality through the application of hard power, believing that they can still dictate the terms of the future through the barrel of a gun. Iran, in response, is playing a game of strategic patience, utilizing geography and mathematical asymmetry as its most effective weapons. They know that they don't have to win a conventional war. They only have to make the cost of Western victory so high that the Western public will not pay it. The real danger today is not the war itself, but the total loss of control over its trajectory. When the realities of global energy, international finance, and geopolitical geography overlap, a single spark, a misidentified drone, a stray missile, a panicked naval commander can ignite a fire that no one, from Washington to Beijing, can extinguish. We are not standing on the edge of an agreement or a new era of cooperation. We are at the gates of a more expansive, more violent, and more costly era than anything we have seen since the 1940s. The sentence that summarizes this entire theater is simple, brutal, and unambiguous. Those who failed to win at the negotiating table in Islamabad will now attempt to seize what remains through fire and steel. But this time, the fire will not be contained to a single border, a single sea, or even a single continent. The mathematical asymmetry of the current conflict suggests that the cost of the next phase will be astronomical for all involved, vaporizing the wealth of nations and the stability of the global order. As the operational windows close and the strategic paralysis deepens, the only certainty is that the old world is being vaporized. The receipts of the coming days will be written in the language of kinetic action, economic collapse, and the cold reality of a world where power is the only currency that matters. Stay sharp, for the truth is no longer being spoken in the halls of diplomacy, it is being written in the heart of the storm. Consider the technical reality of the saturation threat. When we talk about 1,000 missiles, we aren't just talking about a number. We are talking about the physical inability of current defensive systems to process that many incoming targets simultaneously. Each interceptor fired by a Western destroyer costs millions of dollars, and the drone or missile it is intercepting often costs less than a used car. This is the mathematical asymmetry that leads to strategic paralysis. You can win every tactical engagement and still lose the strategic war because you ran out of silver bullets before the enemy ran out of wooden arrows. This is the receipt that Washington refuses to show the public. They are burning through their toolkit at an unsustainable rate, while their adversaries have spent decades building a redundant, low-cost, high-impact infrastructure of resistance. The qualitative military edge was a concept built for a world where only one side had high-tech weapons. That world is gone. Today, the technology of destruction has been democratized. A group of insurgents in a speedboat can now threaten a billion-dollar carrier. A sanctioned nation can build its own satellite-guided missiles. This is the existential reckoning that was faced in Islamabad. The American delegation realized that their threats no longer carried the weight they once did. The blink they were waiting for from Tehran never came. Instead, they were met with a calm, calculated stare and a list of demands that would require the total surrender of American influence in the region. As the vice president's plane climbed into the night sky over Pakistan, the silence in the cabin must have been deafening. They knew that the diplomatic option was a ghost. They knew that the next time they engaged with this adversary, it wouldn't be with words. It would be with the toolkit of kinetic action. But they also knew that the toolkit is missing several key components, and the ones that remain are dull from overuse. This is the definition of strategic paralysis. Knowing what you must do, but also knowing that you lack the resources, the political will, or the mathematical advantage to do it successfully. The Strait of Hormuz closure simulation is not just a what-if scenario. It is the baseline for the next phase of the conflict. 100 days of a closed strait would lead to a 300% increase in global shipping costs. It would lead to fuel rationing in Europe. It would lead to the collapse of major insurance markets that can no longer calculate the risk of maritime trade. This is the non-kinetic nuclear weapon that Iran holds. They don't need a warhead to destroy the West. They only need to stop the flow of the lifeblood. And they have made it clear that they are willing to do exactly that. If their survival is threatened, the Turkish indictment of Israeli officials is the second front in this war. The legal front, by moving to arrest the leadership of a Western-aligned state. Turkey is signaling that it no longer recognizes the legitimacy of the Western security umbrella. They are carving out their own path, one that is increasingly aligned with the multipolar vision of the future. This is a qualitative shift in the regional power architecture. Turkey, a NATO member, is using its legal system to attack the primary ally of the United States. If that isn't a sign of a collapsing order, nothing is. And then there is the Hungarian node. Viktor Orban is more than just a prime minister. He is a symbol of the internal resistance within the West. His defeat would be a victory for the globalist architecture that Washington is trying to preserve. His survival would be a signal that the new right is here to stay and that the Western alliance is permanently fractured. This is why the Israeli Prime Minister's son was in Budapest. This is why the American right is pouring money into a small European country. They are fighting for the soul of their own alliance, even as that alliance is being challenged. On the battlefield, the receipts are all there. The strategic paralysis is real. The operational window is closed. The only thing left is the existential reckoning. The world is about to find out what happens when a superpower that has forgotten how to fight a peer adversary meets an adversary that has been preparing for that fight for 40 years. It won't be a clean war. It won't be over in a week. It will be a grinding, agonizing demolition of the world we thought we knew. The middle class will be vaporized by the economic fallout. The political structures will be shattered by the social unrest, and the map will be redrawn in the blood of those who thought that diplomacy was anything more than a delay tactic. Stay sharp. The official narratives will continue to feed you optimistic fillers until the very moment the lights go out. They will tell you that a deal is close, that the situation is under control, and that hope is on the horizon. They are lying. They are lying because they are terrified. They are terrified because they have seen the math, and they know that the math doesn't favor them. The truth is being written right now, not in the newspapers or on the television screens, but in the flight paths of missiles, the movements of carrier groups, and the desperate silence of failed negotiators. The era of predictable diplomacy is over. The era of fire and steel has begun.